This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for May 24th, 2022. Now, as I like to do, I go to a very pro-Ukrainian live map, and I go to the pro-Ukrainian live map because even though it is obviously biased and it is manipulating what its audience is seeing, if it is still showing Ukraine losing, then I think that tells quite a bit of a story all in and of itself. So it is liveuamap.com. This is an overview of Ukraine, and if we zoom in, I like to go from south to northeast, and all of this red is under Russian control. And as I point out each and every time, this is something you should keep an eye on. The front lines are around Kherson. This is one of the cities that Russia took very early on in late February, early March. And the next city over is Nikolaev. This is a city that Russia is very interested in. And beyond that is Odessa and then Transnistria. And if they were to control all of this, then that would cut what's left of Ukraine off from access to the sea. Now, Kherson has been pretty stable. They're shaping the battlefield to eventually move on Nikolaev, but they're not going to do that until operations are over in the Donbas region, more or less. According to both Russian and Ukrainian sources, there's a lot of activity around Zaporozhye and also beyond that, the Dnipro. And you can see the activity on this pro-Ukrainian live map, and then Russian sources are saying troops are amassing along this front line to move northward. And keep an eye on these strikes. All of these are Russian strikes in and around this area. And if you look, you can see the roads and the rail. You can see this is one of the major hubs in this region that then continues on to the Donbas region. So Russia is hitting this to further complicate the status of Ukrainian logistics in the Donbas region. If we go here to Mariupol, finally they accept that all of Mariupol is under Russian control. It had been since mid to late April, but it's good to see that this pro-Ukrainian map and the Western governments in Kiev have all accepted that that is over and that Russia fully controls Mariupol. Now, around Donetsk, you see the salient coming out, kind of reaching around. It's because this area right here has been infamous for Ukrainian forces staging artillery strikes, rocket strikes into downtown Donetsk, purely civilian targets. It's what they've been doing for 8 years, and this is one of the reasons Russia is in Ukraine in the first place. Avdiivka, keep an eye on that. And then there's this. Well, let's zoom out here first. You see this large encirclement right here. And then Russia has been breaking it into smaller encirclements. And there was an encirclement here, and there was one here around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Popasnya here, this salient has come out and expanded. It expands every day. It is expanding now very quickly. And this gap where Ukrainian forces could potentially retreat through, this is closing every single day. It's becoming impractical for Ukraine to move anything in or out. This salient, this just popped up over the last 2 days. I have seen the West claim that, oh, Russia can't encircle all of this area all at once. This shows that they're weak and incompetent, and they have to settle for these smaller encirclements. We're talking about encirclements that are the size of 2 or 3 cities. That is how big those smaller encirclements are. The much larger encirclement is completely impractical. You can't encircle and then claim that the territory inside, you still have to work those defensive areas within that encirclement. This is what Russia is doing, is defeating in detail a very large Ukrainian force. They are breaking it up into parts and defeating it in detail. This is elementary military strategy. Everyone in the West and East knows about this. So what the West is doing is just lying to the public because they know the public doesn't know, and they can get away with it. That's what they're doing. So there's that. And then there's these two salients, as we have talked about many times in the past, reaching out towards Slavyansk, which is a major hub. And if they take that, pretty much everything in this area, the Donbas region, is going to be cut off. They will be cut off, more or less, and their fighting capacity there will be a cascading effect, a collapse. Now let's look at Kharkov, and let's look at how the offensive is going. It's done. It's done. This is the second or third update I've done since the announcement of the Kharkov offensive, and it went nowhere. It was a political stunt utilizing soldiers with weapons, and they went to the border, they took pictures of a border marker, and then they ran back toward Kharkov city. And then Russia has been pounding those positions and anyone in them for the last couple of days, probably about a week now. So there was no real Kharkov offensive. It was a political stunt passed off as an offensive. And because Ukraine has to do things like this to depict some sort of victory, this shows you just how bad Ukraine is actually doing. And one last thing I forgot to mention, and this is major news, and this is also both Ukrainian and Russian sources are admitting that the assault on Lyman has begun. This is a city. You could see when you see the rail like this, you can tell that it is a hub. It is a significant hub. And you can see how it branches off there. It's very important to control because Russia and Ukraine are both using the rail networks to move troops and equipment around. Very important. And the assault on Lyman has begun. Russian troops are in the urban built-up areas, and they are working on taking that. And they will take that. Ukraine cannot stop what is happening in the Donbas region right now. From May 23rd, this was yesterday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Army General Mark A. Milley hold a press briefing. And they're summing up the second meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. This is a Friends of Syria style forum. And just to put it in perspective, the Friends of Syria, the first meeting had about 50 attendees. The second one, the UK government claims it was 83, but they might be counting countries and organizations. But you could already see that this Ukraine contact group is smaller than the Friends of Syria. And we saw how the Friends of Syria forum turned out, didn't we? That was a group of nations helping support the proxy war in Syria against the Syrian government, but also against Syria's allies, Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also the Russian Federation. We see how that ended. Did not end well. The Friends of Syria did not succeed in their objectives. This contact group is going down the same road. So they're summing that up. They said 47 nations attended. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin says, I'm quoting, "I'm especially grateful to Denmark, which announced today that it will provide a Harpoon launcher and missiles to help Ukraine defend its coast. I'd also like to thank the Czech Republic for its substantial support, including a recent donation of attack helicopters, tanks, and rocket systems. And today, several countries announced new donations of critically needed artillery systems and ammunition, including Italy, Greece, Norway, and Poland. And let me recognize the United Kingdom for its leading role in helping to coordinate security assistance and for the significant quantities of British equipment that continue to flow into Ukraine, and make absolutely no difference." You just saw the map. That is a pro-Ukrainian map showing Ukraine losing the Donbas region. That's what's going on in Ukraine, and all of these additional systems being sent to Ukraine. If you just look at the numbers, these are small numbers, so small that they can't even replace what Ukraine lost. And if they can't replace what they lost, what they started the war out with was not enough to stop Russia. And now they have less than that, and the West cannot replace their losses. So there's that. There's also, again, the problem of Ukraine's military personnel being eliminated, captured or eliminated. You cannot replace them. It takes years of training to replace, especially a lot of the critical roles that these soldiers and other personnel were fulfilling. You cannot replace it quickly. There was a question from the media regarding these rocket launchers that everyone seems to think the US is going to send Ukraine. And again, you cannot just send these sophisticated multi-launch rocket systems to Ukraine and think it's going to make some kind of difference. It takes months, if not years, to effectively integrate these systems into a military, use them effectively on the battlefield, not just push a button and send rockets downrange. You have to coordinate with all sorts of units, spotters, infantry, armored units. Everything has to work together on a modern battlefield or you're going to lose, which is what Ukraine is doing right now. They're losing. So they ask, is the US or any other country prepared to send those major systems to Ukraine? And if that's true, are there any limits on how they can be used, either in Crimea or the Donbas? And they never answer it. Secretary Austin, General Milley, they don't answer that question. And then regarding anti-ship missiles, General Milley says, obviously Odessa is a major port for Ukraine. It's their access to the sea and the outside world, and it becomes a significant vehicle by which grain, for example, is exported and other commodities coming out of Ukraine. And Ukraine is the largest or one of the largest grain producers in the world. And thus far, because of mines, because of the Russian fleet, because of risks associated with it, that has not happened here, now going on almost 90 days. So when General Milley says because of mines, he's talking about Ukrainian mines. Ukraine put all of these mines out into the ocean. They're floating around. Some of them are floating away. And that is one of the reasons why there's no shipping taking place. No commercial shipping is taking place because Ukraine mined its ports. He also says this, the Ukrainians wanting to make sure that there's not any sort of amphibious landing against Odessa. This is what he said. That's what's preventing these grain shipments from leaving Ukraine or anything from arriving in Ukrainian ports, because they mined it. It's a no-go for commercial shipping. That's what General Milley said. Secretary Austin admits that there's no clear definition of what the end of the war is going to look like, because they're losing it, and they can't say now, yeah, victory in Ukraine looks like Russia being pushed out beyond pre-2014 borders. They can't say that because they know how unrealistic it is. As a matter of fact, for the longest time, and not just Secretary Austin or General Milley, but also John Kirby and everyone else, they've been very careful not to define this, because there's no way they can not end up looking weak because they couldn't fulfill that. Because Ukraine is losing, that's why. And the West has no control over this conflict. That is why. There was something that General Milley said. He says, we want to make sure NATO's unified, and we want to uphold the concept that there's a rules-based international order, and the powerful and the big can't just destroy and invade the weak and the small. And he says this with zero irony, zero sense of irony. He doesn't understand that the whole reason this conflict started in the first place is because the United States, a nation that is powerful and big, has encroached onto Russia's borders with NATO. It overthrew the government in Ukraine and installed the client regime that not only sought to join NATO, but began militarizing the country as a direct threat to Russia's national security. The United States, and I pointed this out many times before, didn't just expand NATO up to Russia's border, and didn't just overthrow the Ukrainian government, put a client regime in there, and began militarizing, or you could even say NATOizing Ukraine. They've also have done things directly to Russia. They've been funding opposition groups inside of Russia for years and years, and they've been funding opposition groups in Russia's allies as well within their political systems. Belarus, for example. I don't know if people remember this. This was a prank call to NED. They got the whole team together. Carl Gershman, president of the NED, he was in on it also. And what they did was they admitted the full scope of US interference in Belarus's internal political affairs. And I want you to listen to Carl Gershman from his own mouth. And in case you're wondering whether or not this is real, if this is a real prank call or not, or if it was fabricated, this is a Washington Post article, Why Are Russians Pranking Washington Think Tanks? And this is actually co-written by Damon Wilson, who now heads the National Endowment for Democracy, but at this time he was at the Atlantic Council, and he admits that this happened. This definitely happened. The links for all of this will be in the video description below, including that full prank call. I put a version of it up on my channel with Thai subtitles in case anyone is interested in sharing it with Thai friends. I'm based in Thailand, that's why I did that.
And just a brief word about the NED and its work. The NED, you know, is not a programmatic organization. We're grant making, and we have 4 institutes, and I think all of them are active in Belarus. 2 of them, I think, you know well, because they work very, very closely with you and your team and the Coordination Council, and that's NDI and IRI, our 2 party institutes. And they're under the NED umbrella, and we fund their work, you know, that works on strengthening parties and their messaging, their public outreach, their communications. And I know that they're working with you and your team very, very closely. And we also have a business institute that's associated with our Chamber of Commerce in the United States, the Center for International Private Enterprise, that we have funded to work with the private sector in Belarus to set a vision and a framework for a post-Lukashenko private economic recovery of the country. And we have a labor institute, a trade union institute associated.
I think that we should.
Yeah. And anyway, in addition to these 4 institutes and our Labor Institute, which supports the independent unions in Belarus, we also make grants directly to organizations in Belarus and have done so for a very, very long time. And the critical area here, first of all, is free media. We support the journalists. We're aware of the raid on the offices, you know, several days ago of the Belarus Association. We support people if they have to flee the country. We support their temporary stay in other countries and all the needs that they have. We have been working around the country in the eastern part of the country, in Vitebsk, in Gomel, and other parts of the east on civic participation, and we've made grants to groups. We also have worked in the western part of the country on free media in Grodno and in where we've supported citizen journalism, and then finally for a long time we've also supported Belarus language, history, art, and culture organizations that promote a strong national identity for Belarus, and we realized that the revolution that has taken place in Belarus is really liberation of the Belarus nation. And we've supported a group like Mova Nanova, which has worked on language and cultural history and identity.
So you just heard Carl Gershman, President, CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy, is an organization created and overseen by the US government to interfere politically all around the globe toward regime change. You just heard every aspect that the NED was involved in interfering in Belarus's internal political affairs. And they were doing the exact same thing to Russia. And if you listen to that whole call, that whole conference call, he will even mention that they are doing the exact same thing in Russia. So they're doing all of these things in Belarus. These are things that if the US faced inside its own political system, Russia or China were doing this to the US, it would be absolutely unacceptable. And you could only imagine what the reaction would be. And there would be force used. If they could figure out a way to use force, they would use it. If it was Canada that was being turned against the United States, the same way the US is turning Ukraine against Russia, there would be military intervention. Guaranteed. The US has intervened militarily for far less. They're still in Iraq, they're still in Syria, they're still helping the proxy war unfold in Yemen, they're sending forces to Somalia again. I'm pointing this out, and it seems like I'm off on a tangent here. I'm pointing this out because What General Milley and many others in the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the President of the United States, the Western media keep talking as if Russia is a bully here and they're just trying to help Ukraine defend itself. And that's not the case. I'm pointing this out, this interference in Belarus, for two reasons: to show you what the US has been doing all along Russia's borders all of this time, and what it's doing inside of Russia's borders. Right now, they're still trying to do this. And why is Belarus involved so closely with Russia in this operation in Ukraine? Because they face the exact same threat, and from the US. And we just heard Carl Gershman of the US National Endowment for Democracy, the president of the NED, admitting that they are blatantly violating Belarus's sovereignty in violation of the UN Charter. It is a nation under attack, and they're defending themselves, and so is Russia. And you heard that part where Carl Gershman was talking about promoting culture, and what they're doing is trying to overwrite all of the Russian influence over Belarus, all of the connections between Belarus and Russia. They're trying to overwrite that with this artificial, far-right, neo-Nazi ideology, exactly what they did in Ukraine. And you see these red and white flags on the screen. This is what they were flying around during these protests. This is not the flag of Belarus. Take a look at this Guardian article, how two flags of Belarus became symbols of confrontation. So there's the real flag of Belarus, it's red and green, predominantly red and green flag. And then there's this white and red flag. Where did this white and red flag come from? Well, we know the red and black flag that we've seen Ukrainians waving. That is the flag of the Nazi collaborators during World War II. And would you be surprised if I told you this white and red flag from Belarus is also the Nazi collaborator flag from World War II? As a matter of fact, if you just go to Wikipedia of all places, I mean, if they're admitting it, this should tell you something. Belarusian collaboration with Nazi Germany, and they're talking about Belarusian National Socialist Party and this group of Belarusian nationalists. Even when you hover the mouse over it, you see this flag that is now used by the protesters in opposition. And if you go here, Belarusian Democratic Republic, that was the flag. So this was a group of people in Belarus that were trying to seize power, and they collaborated with the Nazis. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, they had that flag before they collaborated with the Nazis, but they wove that flag while collaborating with the Nazis. So you know what that means? That means if you want to wave a different flag other than Belarus's actual flag, pick another one, because that one has been used by Nazi collaborators. What sense does that make? What do you lose by just switching the flag? But they can't, because that tie with the far right and with Nazism is very important. The hardliners in Belarus that are going to carry out the violence needed to overthrow the government of Belarus is something they cannot give up. They cannot give up that tie to Nazi collaboration. And I just want to show you this. The militants from Belarus volunteering to go fight Russia and Ukraine, they are also waving the flag around. This should surprise nobody. The US is very unimaginative. When they start working on a targeted nation, they have one playbook, and the only things that change are very superficial. What they did in Ukraine and what they did in Belarus is almost indistinguishable, except for the names of the organizations, and the color of the flag. And even there's not much of a difference. And again, it's not myself associating the protests with the militants now flooding into Ukraine from Belarus. This is ABC Australia. Volunteers who fled authorities in Belarus fight for Ukraine in hopes it will help change things in their homeland. So that's the Western media connecting all of this together. And if you come down here, you see all these militants, and then they show you a picture of the protests with the Nazi collaborator flag. It's not me connecting all of this. It's not Russian President Vladimir Putin connecting all of this in his imagination. It's the West connecting it, because it is all connected. It is all part of the same operation of encircling and containing Russia, and then eventually overthrowing the political order in Russia itself. And they've used all of these tactics, everything from political subversion to actual warfare, or warfare by proxy. They have used all of it. And that is what's going on. That is how we got here to this conflict in Ukraine, and Russia being involved. They didn't just wake up one day and decide to do this. So again, that might have seemed like a tangent. I'm going to get back to the Pentagon briefing. That seems like a little bit of a tangent, but I think that's very important information, important context to understand, especially when we see Belarus working so closely with Russia. Getting back to the briefing, Secretary Austin says, this is what he says. He's talking about, again, people are desperate for him or anyone else in the Pentagon to tell them, you know, that at the end of this, Russia will completely lose, and he cannot. This is what he says. At the very outset, Russian President Vladimir Putin, envisioned using overwhelming force and speed and power to very rapidly take down the capital city and replace the government. They failed in that respect, and their forces were pushed back by the Ukrainians. They took Kharkov. The Russians took Kharkov for a short period of time. The Ukrainians counterattacked and took Kharkov back. And so we've seen them really proceed at a very slow and unsuccessful pace on the battlefield. And you would expect that President Putin, would seek to use other levers of power, other instruments of power. And he's doing that. But in terms of what his overall strategy is, that's unknown. Yes, it's unknown, or it's something that they don't want to talk about, because if they talk about it, it'll paint a very dreary picture for Ukraine. So there's a couple of things here that he's saying that aren't entirely untrue, but it's a misrepresentation of what happened. When this conflict first began, Russia was prepared simultaneously to execute two plans. The first plan was an extremely high risk, but also high reward strategy of surging into Ukraine, shocking Ukrainian troops and politicians into surrendering or fleeing. And they did this across the entire country. We remember what the map looked like. There were Russian troops everywhere, around or in every single major city. Cities like Kherson and pretty much the entire south, this worked perfectly. They flooded in, they took these cities with almost no fighting, and then they've held them ever since, and they were able to consolidate their position, and I'll get into why they were able to do that. And for cities like Mariupol, where Ukrainian forces got kind of trapped in there, they were able to encircle Mariupol in this opening phase. When they surrounded Kiev, I would say the first couple of days, it was obvious that they were not going to succeed in that aspect. As soon as they realized that, they decided that they will go from surging and shocking to fixing. They knew they did not have enough troops to encircle and take Kiev if the military in Ukraine was determined to defend it. They knew that. They're not stupid. They know how to take a city. They just took Mariupol completely, indisputably. Those forces began fixing Ukrainian troops in place. And we know this because, remember super soldier Wally, the Canadian expert sniper? That's where he was. He was in and around Kiev during this opening phase. He and thousands of Ukrainian troops and volunteers, they were all trapped in Kiev, fighting with this Russian force outside of Kiev that never intended to take the city. When they realized they weren't going to shock the city into surrender, they knew they weren't going to take it. It's impossible. They didn't have the numbers to take Kiev. But all of those Ukrainian forces were pinned down in Kiev. They had to stay there. It was still a significant force. If they sent their troops elsewhere to try to break out the troops in Mariupol, or to try to take back Kherson, if they tried to do that, Kiev might have fallen. They had to keep those troops there. That's why Russia kept those troops there, to fix them into position. And they did that all across the north and northeast of Ukraine. And that is how Russia was able to consolidate power over Kherson permanently. I mean, they're using rubles there now. That's how permanent it is. And from Kherson all the way to the Donbas region and the border of the Russian Federation, they were able to consolidate control over that, encircle and take Mariupol, because all those Ukrainian forces were fixed in the north and northeast. And as soon as they were sure that they had the south and they wanted to focus entirely on the Donbas region, they withdrew those troops. They didn't get pushed out from Kiev. They announced it a week earlier, and then they did a very orderly withdrawal from around Kiev. That is not Ukraine pushing them out. So it's important to understand that. And Wally, the expert super soldier sniper from Canada, after Russian troops withdrew from around Kiev, they sent him to the Donbas region. And if Russian forces didn't stay there, after the first couple of days, they're like, well, we're not taking Kiev, let's leave. If they did that, Wally would have been on his way very early on to the Donbas region, where it might have made a difference. By the time he got to the Donbas region, everybody was being killed by Russian artillery, Russian tanks. He was running around with a javelin. He could not get close enough to the Russian tanks to get a shot off with his javelin without everyone around him being killed by very precise tank fire from the Russians. This is his own interview that he gave upon returning to Canada. He's not still in Ukraine. He saw how hopeless it was, and he went home. That's him saying that in his own interview. And I'll put that link in the video description below, just in case you don't believe me. So that's what has happened from the beginning of this conflict to where we are now. And in the Donbas region, I just showed you the pro-Ukrainian map showing the Russians making quite a bit of progress now. So the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd, he has to say this. He's not going to say, oh, yeah, Russia is going to win. He can't say that. And that's about it. I mean, the briefing, they didn't really have a lot to say. They're going to send more heavy weapons to Ukraine that are going to make no difference. The heavy weapons they've already sent are not making any difference. Those M777s are being found and destroyed, just like all of Ukraine's artillery that they had at the beginning, which is why they're begging for more artillery in the first place. When in this briefing they said it was critically needed, it's because they're losing it. They're losing it. They don't have additional artillerymen coming into service. They have artillerymen who have lost their guns and they need new guns. So some items to watch. Again, keep an eye on these encirclements in the Donbas region. There's these big cauldrons, and then there's encirclements inside these cauldrons. They're defeating in detail the Ukrainian forces there. That is what they're doing, which is, again, elementary military strategy. And as some Western pundit is saying, well, they have to do these smaller battles. These are city-sized battles. They're not small. They look small on a map if you're completely ignorant of how maps work, I guess. I mean, I don't get that. I guess they have to say what they can to try to make it look like something other than what it is Russia defeating the Ukrainian military in detail in the Donbas region. Keep an eye on that. There's the cauldron from Lyman to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and down to Popasnia. Keep an eye on that whole area. That is very critical right now. The Kharkov offensive, as far as I can tell, is totally over. Wasn't much of an offensive to begin with. And just remind yourself that was something that the Western media was touting as some sort of huge, breakthrough or achievement by Ukrainian forces. And look at how meaningless it actually is. And just ask yourself, what does that say that they're making these things up? What does that say about how it's actually going for Ukraine? When that doubt starts to creep in the back of your mind because Western propaganda is so persistent, just keep that little fact in mind. Also keep in mind, we just heard senior US defense officials say that the reason grain shipments cannot leave Ukrainian ports is because Ukraine itself mined the ports and made commercial shipping impossible. No ship can go in there as long as those mines are floating around. That's not Russia doing that. But keep an eye out on the excuses and the shifting of blame that they're going to do to make it look like it's Russia's fault that this is happening. Just keep an eye on that. And the idea of them breaking the Russian blockade with these Harpoon missiles, they might threaten Russian surface ships, surface vessels, but the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, has a number of submarines also. Harpoon missiles aren't going to hit the submarines. So again, this is the West grasping at straws, and they're teeing up the next wonder weapon that they're going to promote and make it look like this will be the game changer. It's the game is over for Ukraine. Nothing that the US and NATO can send Ukraine at this point is going to change anything. The only thing that can reverse Ukraine's loss is a direct NATO intervention. And the way I think it's going to play out is they will wait until the very last minute, and they will intervene in the Western Ukraine, And they will create a buffer zone there, just like they did in Syria. And they may also try to grab Odessa. Otherwise, whatever is left of Ukraine is going to be this landlocked, dysfunctional, Nazi-infested, failed state that doesn't even have access to the ocean. It'll be even sadder than it already is right now. The way that they have destroyed Ukraine from 2014 onward is just so disgraceful. So that does it for this update. Again, as usual, if anything major happens, I'll do a video right away, or it'll be a couple of days before I do another update on the situation in Ukraine. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work, like on Odyssey, Rumble, and also on Telegram. That's in case YouTube deletes my channel. I've already been deleted off of Twitter for my reporting on Ukraine. I showed a Getty image that had a Nazi black sun. I pointed that out and I was deleted permanently off of Twitter. In the video description below, you'll also find links to all of the sources that I referenced for this update, as well as for ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also through PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's month-to-month memberships, one-time donations, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, sending kind words or news tips, I appreciate all of that help. I could not do this work without that help, so thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.